Welcome to the third episode of the Seeking Wisdom in Stories podcast. For this episode, we're going to explore the theme of the father wound and how it's an effective element in storytelling that also resonates in real-life experience. The father wound can be described as a traumatic pain caused at the soul level, especially when dealt by a father figure who made an unforgettable impression that affects the way you look at yourself and the world. Sometimes it can be a hurtful word directed at a child by a father, or it can be the absence of a positive reinforcement, and in the absence of a father's affirming strength, the child feels lost and adrift without that reinforcement. The father wound is a mark of the broken world that we live in. What makes the father wound so potent as a storytelling element is that it sets the protagonist up with considerable baggage. The wound could drive the protagonist's greatest fears, and this is a powerful motivation that plays out over a storyline. A story about a father wound also seems to be frequently paired with stories of redemption, a comeback story, or a coming-of-age tale. These types of stories work well with a father wound element because it's effective in creating internal conflict in a protagonist that also translates to external conflict in relationships with other characters. For example, in Season 1 of the Invincible series, based on the Robert Kirkman comic, the young hero Mark, otherwise known as Invincible, comes of age by stepping into his new identity as a superhero. He's mentored by his father Nolan, who also is a superhero called Omni-Man, but Mark's world is turned upside down when he discovers that his father has a villainous side that could lead to the extermination of humanity. Within Season 1 of the series, Mark is traumatized by the reversal of how he sees his father, going from hero to antagonist. Grieving the loss of the world he once knew, Mark has to face off against his father and suffers brutally for trying to stop him. In Season 1 of the Arcane series, the burden of father figures loom over Vi and Jinx. As a teenager, Vi is mentored by the grizzled Vander, and his death leaves an absence that hurts her deeply. It even leads to the separation between Vi and her sister Powder, who later becomes Jinx. Meanwhile, Jinx is later adopted by a surrogate father, the villain Silco. As she grows older, Jinx's chaotic actions are enabled by Silco, who paints a world view that the whole world, especially the topsiders, are against them. We later see that Silco provides positive affirmation to Jinx that no one else seemed to give to her, or at least that she accepted. But we also see that Silco's influence puts Jinx at odds with her sister Vi, and it complicates any possible reconciliation between them. In the 90s animated classic The Lion King, many of us are familiar with how Mufasa's death and the twisting of the truth by villainous Scar leads young Mufasa to initially shun his path in life to become king. Simba believes that he caused his father's death, and the shame and the guilt of this drives him into hiding away and squandering his true potential and proper place in the circle of life. Of course, in discussing The Lion King, we can't ignore the legacy of William Shakespeare's Hamlet. For a story that starts in media res, or in the middle of the action, we see young Hamlet meeting the ghost of his murdered father in the first scene of the play. The burden of his father's death weighs on Hamlet, driving his internal struggles as well as his eventual actions. In the Cobra Kai series, which continues the lives of characters from the original Karate Kid movies, there are several surrogate father-son relationships that compete with each other and cause conflict. We discover that Johnny Lawrence suffered from an abusive relationship with his wealthy father, and this drove him into another abusive dynamic with Cobra Kai founder John Kreese. Years later, Johnny turns his life around and mentors Miguel, who becomes a surrogate son. Meanwhile, Johnny's biological son Robbie returns to his life. Robbie wrestles with feeling abandoned by Johnny, and this fuels a competitive relationship with Miguel on and off the karate mat. In the film The Amazing Spider-Man, Peter Parker is raised by his Uncle Ben and Aunt May, but it is the disappearance and death of his parents, especially his father, that weighs heavily on an angsty Peter. The teenager who eventually becomes Spider-Man struggles with abandonment and not knowing his self-worth because he doesn't have closure on why his father left him years ago. In the game The Last of Us Part 2, Ellie discovers that Joel lied to her during the final events of the first game when he rescued her from the Fireflies. That's one of the greatest moments in the first game when Ellie asks Joel to tell her the truth about the cure, and he blatantly lies to her, believing that he's protecting her. Instead, years later, Joel's choice serves to drive a wedge between them and sets tragic events into motion. In the series Game of Thrones, one of the most beloved characters, Tyrion Lannister, is shamed by his father, Tywin, for being born a dwarf. Tyrion responds with sardonic wit and a subversive personality, but we see that his father's emotional disowning of him has shaped his path in life. In the animated film How to Train Your Dragon, Young Hiccup wrestles with not measuring up to the expectations of his father Stoic. While Stoic is a loving father, his presence and hopes for Hiccup initially mar the way Hiccup looks at himself and what his role in the world could be, while also complicating his new friendship with the dragon Toothless. In the film Batman Begins, a pre-Batman Bruce Wayne is consumed with overwhelming anger that drives his thoughts and his actions after his parents are murdered. We see flashbacks of his father Thomas Wayne, who comes across as a decent good man. He even bestows a mantra to young Bruce that becomes a theme for the film. Why do we fall down? So we learn how to pick ourselves up again. It's fascinating that even a good father, or the absence of a good father, can do damage to a protagonist. It should also be mentioned that mother figures also are effective in stories in delivering a wound to their children. In the animated film Tangled, Rapunzel had to escape the imprisonment of her surrogate mother, Gothel. And in the HBO series The Sopranos, Tony Soprano bears the burden of an emotionally abusive mother, Livia, who also puts a plan in action to murder him. But if we return to the idea of a father wound, its use as a storytelling element is prevalent and effective because it's very relatable. Many of us have experienced the fallout from mistakes in parenting from our fathers and mothers. Even those who grew up without parents may wrestle with the absence of them or suffered wounds from a surrogate parental figure. It seems that much of our internal struggles begin with our families of origin. As mentioned earlier, the father wound is one way to look at developing what a character fears most. It lets us into the heart and mind of a character because we start to dig deep into personal history, and we ask questions to unearth what happened to that character at a young age. Is it possible that a specific trait of the character is tied to how he related to his father in the past? Exploring these questions might even help us to identify key flaws to the character, the fallacies, contradictions, and quirks that make the character real and interesting to watch. So when a character is burdened with a father wound, stories of redemption, comebacks, and coming of age pave the way for a lengthy story arc to unfold. We want to see that character overcome his struggles and to move on victoriously. We feel the catharsis that happens when a character is transformed over a worthwhile journey. I think the father wound reveals part of the power of storytelling. We can relate to the burdens of characters wrestling with these wounds, and we yearn to find meaning and catharsis through their journeys. Maybe deep down inside, we want that earned victory in our own lives. That's because we're searching for answers to some of the deepest questions in our souls. Thank you for listening to this third episode of the Seeking Wisdom in Stories podcast. I appreciate you taking time to listen in, and I hope to share more with you in the next episode.